Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Nick. It's so great to have you here. Could you just give us a little bit of background on your work?
Sure. I'm an academic. I'm a senior lecturer in international studies and global societies at UTS, the University of Technology, Sydney. And so I've been working for a number of years in international studies and also did my PhD at UTS. And within the international studies program at UTS, I'm quite specialized in the area of Spanish studies. So on kind of the history and political context, of Spanish politics and contemporary society in general. But over the years, my research and work is a bit broader. So I look at, a number of things, including popular culture, queer studies, things like masculinity, and now I'm particularly focused on the concept of crisis.
So we were speaking before that you started off focused on journalism in your studies. Did you always want to be a journalist or?
Yeah, it's a strange thing. So I come from a working class family. I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, and I'm also the first in my family to go to university. So, I didn't really have a lot of kind of guidance about what I should study, or even kind of, I just basically get the normal questions. How's it going? How's school going? And I'd say, good. And that was about it. So it's kind of like left to my own devices. And somehow I was, growing up, it was one of two things that I wanted to be. I was either thinking a psychologist or a journalist. Don't know why the psychology, but anyway, I think as I leading up to finishing my HSC, finishing high school, I had decided by then on journalism, and then I started studying media and cultural studies at Macquarie University. So I was quite, I think it's quite rare for an 18-year-old to be so clear about what their career, ambitions are, and I had that.
Well, why did you have that?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I don't know. So as I said, it was a very working class family. My dad worked in a factory. My mother was a housewife. She was at home constantly. So a lot of my learning was done, I suppose, through the media and through television and reading. So I think that's what I felt kind of most connected to, and I could kind of see a path for me through that. And I also quite enjoyed writing, at that time. So I think, I was good at English. I enjoyed writing. I was, even writing things like poetry and plays at that time. Quite involved in the City Theatre Company's kind of young playwrights, etc. So it just seemed, quite logical.
Well, I guess psychology and journalism, if you wanted to link them, you could say that they're both kind of studying what people do.
Yeah. Look, I suppose so. I've never really thought about it. I know I had psychology, in my background growing up, but I've never really kind of thought about how that linked in with journalism. But then, I got into journalism at Macquarie University, and that was through a degree called Bachelor of Media and Cultural Studies. So it was kind of like bringing two disciplines together. So I did the media, focus on the writing, and that included creative writing and nonfiction writing.
But at the time, I guess when you were 18 with that clear idea, which is unbelievably rare, how did you see yourself positioned in future? Like, what did you think you were going to achieve in that?
Yeah, look, a good question. I kind of had a vague goal that I would be a journalist working somewhere, whether it was, on television or in a newspaper or the Sydney Morning Herald or something like that. But at the same time, I was completely, out of my element as well. So a lot of kind of imposter syndrome, and I just didn't know how to kind of get into that media world. I think, I studied more than 20 years ago now, so I think universities and degrees have changed a bit more. They're a bit more focused on career goals and development goals, whereas, that didn't really exist when I was at university. Just went and did your subjects, and and that was it. There was no real career conversation.
Well, I guess, sorry to focus on this if you don't want to focus on it, but that desire to be on TV or like in writing, I guess every 18-year-old boy desires to be on TV.
Yeah, look, I did it. I'm not necessarily think I'd be kind of on TV, but maybe working.
Yeah.
Working on TV. I didn't really see myself as being the face of anything. If anything, I'm quite introverted, bit of social anxiety, etc. So, I don't necessarily like being the center of attention, right? But I like the idea of, reporting and finding out about the world, basically.
Well, why do you think you wanted to find out about the world if you were, as you said, in a fairly insulated working class family? Was it just a desire to explore? Or?
Yeah. Look, so I think it's, I don't think it's a unique experience. I think lots of people in my situation, and remember, this is pre-internet, pre-social media, pre-everything. So, if you live kind of on the periphery, on the fringes of a city like Sydney, and sure, the kind of cities there, and I had my parents were great, etc., and based on who they actually were, there were kind of lots of connections, etc. But most of your life was kind of built around a small community, a small kind of suburb, and if you're a little bit kind of intellectual or had a little bit of curiosity about the world, then you found that that environment quite limiting. So there was always that desire, I think, to not only get out of that, but it was always beyond Sydney and beyond Australia. I always had this view of or desire to kind of go out there and get to know the world.
Okay, well, can you speak a little bit to, we were talking about it before we started, but your transition from journalism?
Yeah, look, there's not much of a transition to talk about. So I finished my degree, and if anything, I actually found the cultural studies subjects much more kind of interesting. So, many universities don't really have much cultural studies anymore. It was quite a novelty, I think, back then. But then, so, here I was like an 18-year-old coming from that environment, and then they're getting us to read, Lacan and Freud and, queer theory and all these things about kind of identity and subjectivity, etc. For an 18, 19-year-old, that was, reading Foucault, etc. That was like quite, mind-blowing. I think when the home environment was, or the way that you had grown up had been, so limiting. So I finished. I did get a job at the Sydney Morning Herald as a journalist, working in the advertising department, and I was also a freelancer for the Sydney Star Observer. The Sydney Star Observer?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Like the local Sydney gay paper, and they had me doing a section called the Western Star Observer. So it was like stories about queer communities in the western suburbs. So that was like my role. But then I just basically realized that it was not necessarily like a world that really appealed to me anymore, or that I necessarily kind of aspired to. So I spent a year, almost a year traveling. So backpacking with my then partner. We went to different countries. And when I got back to Australia, I thought, well, maybe it's the right time to do some more study. And I decided to do a master's in international studies. I think that kind of always appealed to me, especially since I'd just been traveling in about 20 countries or so around the world. And that's what I did.
And at that point in time, I guess establishing the timeline of your goals more broadly, if it was exploration at first with journalism, was that still the priority here?
Yeah, no, look, I was, I don't think there was even any, I didn't even think of any priorities. So I think the fact that I enrolled into a course and I was learning things that interested me, that was kind of enough. In that degree, I did need to learn a language, and I chose Spanish. And it did involve also going to study 6 months in another country. So with my Spanish, I was supposed to go to Barcelona for 6 months. So that was the immediate goal. Learn the language, go spend time in Barcelona. I wasn't thinking necessarily about a career path out of that. Except basically what happened was, without going into my personal life, I couldn't go at that particular time to spend those 6 months in Barcelona. And, the university basically said, well, look, if you're not going to Barcelona to do those credit points, then you need to replace those credit points by doing a dissertation. And that's what I did. So I'd already chosen Spanish in Spain, so I had to do a dissertation on Spain. And that's what I did. Apparently,
much worse than a 6-month holiday.
Much worse, such is life. Such is life. I couldn't manage to, unfortunately, have my 6 months. So I did that, did it well, and then my supervisor, Paul Alexander, who worked at UTS for many years, he asked me to, you recommended I apply for a PhD. And I had never in my life thought of doing a PhD. So that was never in my wildest, imagination. One, that I'd be capable. Two, that was even a path for me. So.
And your decision to pursue the PhD, I think, I was talking to Noel Castry about this, and I think you listened to that one where he was saying like a lot of postgraduate study is just because you just like don't really know what to do.
Yeah, that's probably
okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I've developed a reputation at work as someone that kind of is agreeable to things, that says yes to what's asked of me. And speaking with some colleagues about it, they seem to, they kind of broken down my life and my, I suppose if you want to call it my philosophy to life. And it's basically, it's just saying okay, like I never say no. So if someone offers an opportunity or a suggestion, I tend to kind of just say okay, just like you asked me to do this podcast, and I said okay. And I think that's been the kind of underlying narrative of my, of my life, just kind of saying okay to things which then lead to the next thing.
Well, I mean, I think if there is one consistency among people at the top of their fields, it's that they just take all opportunities that they can get.
Yeah,
it's like the Batman butler, I can't remember his name, the actor, who says Michael Caine, who says just do 10 things and one of them will be good. So can you speak a little bit to what your PhD was actually focused on?
Sure. So it did take me a while to work it out, like a year or so. But I had a very understanding PhD supervisor. He kind of gave me that time to work things out. Like, I think it's a bit more systematic these days. Doing a PhD, you need to have quite a lot done to kind of get accepted, and there's all these different stage assessments to make sure that the students are on track, which is good because it's a way of supporting the student and getting them through. But I didn't have that, but then I think that kind of worked in my favor. So my PhD was basically about contemporary Spanish politics, but but I was particularly looking at the role of historical memory on those politics. So, I used kind of narrative theory, kind of looking at the kind of social and political narratives and of historical memory, etc., tracing from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, all the way to the present day. So this kind of like narrative of Las Dos Españas, they call it, or the narrative of the two Spains, talks about two different kind of conceptualizations of the country. So quite common these days with all the kind of culture wars that you hear about, or the red state and the blue state, etc. But I think, lots of people kind of get caught up in the English-speaking countries and the Anglo world and what's happening in the UK with Brexit or in the US, so with Trump and the reaction against what they call woke culture. But whereas in Spain, this kind of polarization has existed for decades before, and it's from even before the 1930s, right? So the 1930s is just when the Civil War actually happened. And you can pretty much trace every subsequent event in Spanish politics to that division. So that's kind of what I sought to do in my thesis, to kind of trace that narrative and see how it works and how it circulates in society.
Can you explain a bit about what those two Spains are?
Yeah, sure. So in shorthand, so you have what they call conservative Spain, or nationalist Spain. So this is kind of the traditional Spain that's kind of ultra Catholic, very much respectful of Spanish traditions, and the traditions inherited from the Catholic Church, and it has a very kind of clear identity about what it means to be Spanish, and it's quite a unified identity. So it's this idea that Spain is one indissoluble kind of nation, and there's kind of one identity that kind of belongs to all of that Spain. So that's basically Castilian. So that what we know as Spanish is Castellano, is Castilian. But that's only like one, major kind of culture within Spain. It's not all of Spain. So for example, they're very much about the unified country, not about respecting, say, Catalonia or the Basque Country or the regions or anything that kind of interferes with that kind of unified vision of Spain. As well, it's quite conservative, so it's very anti-left wing, very anti-communist, and very kind of anti anything that's against tradition, so anti-gay, anti-feminism, etc. Then you have liberal Spain, which sought to kind of adopt the values of the French Revolution, kind of into Spanish society. So very much against the authority of the church, very much about...
Was that
a plural?
Sorry, contemporarily to the French Revolution?
No, it's much later.
Okay.
Yeah. So French Revolution, talking about 1789. So these ideas probably came around the end of the 19th century in Spain, provoked by what they call the disaster in 1898, which is when Spain lost its remaining 4 colonies in the world, and that was like the disaster that kind of Spain, which was this dominant kind of European power in the world, had now kind of lost everything, and led to this kind of like identity crisis.
So this is a very, I don't want to say specific, but in a way specific PhD topic. How did you decide on this?
Yeah, look, as I said, it just evolved organically. So I think that dissertation that I said that I did was specifically about the Basque Country and Basque nationalism. And there's quite a lot about that in my PhD thesis as well. So just, that was a starting point. And as I kind of continued to research and read, and I read more about the division of the two Spains, I was like, yeah, that's what I kind of want to concentrate on.
So going forward now, how do you see you're not, obviously now you're not as involved directly in Spain, how do you see the role of your work, especially in regard to it being here in Australia?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And I think it kind of goes to, it plays to, I think, what the purpose of kind of area studies or what we try to do with international studies is kind of fall about, right? So obviously in academia, and I think we're all guilty of it, but we tend to universalize trends. We tend to, we want a big theory that explains why certain things are happening. And we tend to use our own kind of dominant culture to kind of make those theories, right? So even though Spain is a Western country, it's got quite a different historical trajectory than, say, the English-speaking countries. So in the Australian context, it's like when you turn on the media or you listen to something and you hear about what is meant to be international, it just basically focuses on the UK and the US, right? It's very difficult. I'll talk about the China threat or a little bit about Japan or whatever, because that's in our region. But, there's only one dominant perspective, and that's that Anglo perspective, right? So all of these things about, what's kind of happening in society with polarization, etc. It's presented as kind of something new, right? With populism and what's kind of happened in the last 10, 15 years with the election of Trump and etc. But if you have that specific knowledge of a different society, which is still not that far removed, Spain is still Western Europe, right?
Yeah, very much.
But you'd be surprised that almost nobody knows anything about it. And you actually get to see, well, there is something else kind of going on. There's a different kind of trajectory, and maybe we could actually learn from that. So that's what we actually try to do with our students. So when students come to UTS and they do international studies, we send them overseas for a year to study in the language that they're that they're doing, and they actually do a research project in that country, and they need to be engaged with the language as well. So one is like a lot of my research, particularly in the PhD, used a lot of like Spanish language books and media, etc., because you can't just rely on what's written kind of on the BBC, right?
Yeah.
If you want that other perspective. And what's interesting to me, when you work with students in this program, and why I actually like my job and why I still think that international studies is important, it can be reduced to like one particular assessment task that the students do. So basically, for example, if a student is going to Spain, and they don't only go to Spain, they go to many different countries. But say that one particular student is going to Spain. After a month, we ask them to write a cultural report reflecting on an aspect of Spanish society that really kind of surprises them or shocks them in a particular way. And they need to kind of analyze that and be kind of self-reflective on that. And it's really interesting that if you read what the students write, they pick something and they compare it to how things are in Australia, right? Without reducing it kind of too much is more complicated, but basically kind of comes down to Spain. Things would just be so much easier if Spain did things like Australia does. Right? That can sum up what the students write. But then they spend a year studying in the country. They do their research project, etc. And then just when they're coming back or just when they returned, we ask them to read that again and reflect on their culture report. And that's where things really get interesting. That's when you actually see students really embarrassed by what they wrote a year prior. And you can really see how their understanding of Australian society, their understanding of the world, and also like their understanding of themselves has changed dramatically in like about 11 months.
Well, I know you can't give literal examples, but can you give some more tangibility to it? Like how do these changes kind of manifest?
Yeah, so it'll be things like, for example, in Australian society, for example, um, you know, it's much more regimented, right? So it's much more rules based about time, the way things are done, the way society is organized, the way social life is kind of organized. And students, for example, would have, the point of view that the society that they're coming from, the Australian context, is the default, is the way things kind of should be, right? And they can't see, they can't really see the purpose of a society doing things in a different way, because to them it just doesn't make sense, just doesn't work. But then after a year, they kind of realize, well, they start questioning about why we do things in Australia, in a particular way, and then they start to kind of see. I don't know if they're called, they're not necessarily benefits, but they start to see, doing things in this kind of other way, or this, what on the outside might seem a bit more disorganized, actually leads to, some of these other different outcomes, which we don't have in Australia. And probably Australia would be better if we kind of did things the way Spain did them.
Okay, so bringing that back to Australia, what do you think is the benefit to those students having that perspective in Australian life?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. So we do a lot of work on this. As I used to be the coordinator of the degree itself. So there's always, you always want to understand what the degree is doing, if it's serving students, how students actually perceive it, how industry or employers will kind of see this degree, and all of our research has shown that it is valued not only by the students but for example by employers, because there's a huge difference between a student that has spent the whole time just in the Australian context, or a student that has had 6 to 12 months living in another country. So it goes to what I say is this kind of confusion in Australian society about, how open Australians really are about the international, right? So a lot of Australians kind of confuse multiculturalism with an ability to kind of, work internationally. But multiculturalism, which means that, an Australian teenager might have friends from Thailand or Brazil or Colombia or China or whatever, but they're all kind of in the Australian context, in the same educational kind of context, right? So when you're actually going physically overseas to kind of study and work in a different culture, that's where, it's not about multiculturalism anymore, right? It's the Australian society is not the default anymore, right? So you are the one kind of out of your element. You're the one that kind of needs to adapt to something else. And that's what employers like about students who have, lived overseas. And the students kind of say that themselves when, the minute they are back. Yeah, they see that.
Well, that in a way is quite far removed from the original goal of journalism. In another way, not so much. What do you hope to achieve with your work now?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. So I'm still a firm believer of internationalization, right, in the Australian educational context. So if I can do anything to keep promoting that and ensuring that those experiences are available to students, then I think, I'd be very satisfied with that. And, I see it pedagogically, I see it as the university's, and society's responsibility to make sure that, tertiary students have, intercultural competency, right? So I think that's like a baseline. So anything that I can do for that, I think is a positive thing. In terms of my research, academia is, in the Australian context, and particularly the English language countries context, is changing quite a lot. So in In the European context, you could still kind of specialize on a particular country, and you would probably be quite a philologist. And there's lots of these sorts of academics in European universities going along, doing their work, and they go to their conferences and etc. That's become more difficult in the Australian context, particularly because area studies is closely linked to language studies. Languages at universities are a hard sell, right? So students do them less and less. Many universities are cutting a lot of these languages. They're also quite expensive to teach because they require lots of contact hours. So, kind of linking your research identity to philology or to kind of a particular kind of country is kind of a hard sell, right? So in this case, in this sense, I've kind of have a two-track research career where I still want to maintain that expertise that I've kind of developed as a Spain expert, and I still publish on a number of those things. On the other hand, I'm also kind of try to foster my identity as a kind of more general cultural theorist, to look at kind of a number of different kind of cultural trends that are not limited to one specific society.
So, I guess stepping past that, you said it would be very satisfying for you to provide those experiences pedagogically. Why is that? And on the academics side, why are you now interested in doing more study, essentially?
More study? More research?
More research and publications and stuff.
Yeah, okay. So I think in terms of the international experience, look, I'll give you like one example of a former student of mine, and I think it can kind of reflect the power of a study abroad, and why I'm such a kind of fervent believer of it. So, for example, and this is just like one example. So, for example, one student that I had was quite shy, a bit kind of unsure of herself. She was a great student, right? Very nice and everything, but I think we sent 5 students together to the city of Granada, which is quite popular, in Spain. And I think she was the kind of least confident of the 5. But anyway, so when students do the research there, they're supervised by one of the UTS academics. So I was supervising these 5 students and their research projects. So she was a social and political sciences student. She ended up deciding to do her research project on energy poverty from the city of in the city of Granada. So despite her kind of hesitance or shyness, these are applied research projects, so they need to kind of interview people and survey people, etc. So she managed to kind of get involved with different NGOs in the city and interview people kind of working with communities that kind of were struggling, and then researching a lot about what the policies kind of were in the European Union context, and also in the Spanish and local context. But she did a brilliant job of this, in this research project. Came back to Sydney, finished her degree, and then she ended up getting going for a job at the New South Wales Premier's office. And she got the job as a researcher, particularly because she had done research on energy poverty, and 2, because she had done research, comparative research in a different kind of context. And I think that just really kind of shows how valued that is, not only in the public sector, but is in the private sector as well. And her career in the last 2 or 3 years has just kind of boomed. And she's been in a number of positions, and she comes and does a number of talks to new students for us. So just to see her trajectory, and I know that's just kind of one student, but you see it with so many students every year, and like, you know, you get that kind of vicarious, um, um, you know, satisfaction of seeing that student journey. And then you asked me about research.
Well, yeah, that's a great point to follow up on. Is that satisfaction the goal of your work now?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think so. You know, I think I ended up getting an ongoing position as an academic about 4 years ago. And for academics, that's usually the goal, right? So many students finish a PhD, but then they're kind of stuck in casual teaching, etc. And regardless of how good you are, or, you know, whatever, it's like just based on circumstances, you might end up in an ongoing position or you might not. So I was quite lucky that I did get into a position, simply because you know, people that were already in that position left the institution, right? Which means, you know, a job had become available. And in Australia, there's not many people that are, you know, have PhD in Spanish studies. And then I think I was asked, okay, so now you need to decide on what kind of academic you want to be. Like, what do you mean? I'm an academic. Like, you know, for me, I had reached the end goal, which is getting the permanent job. And then it's like, well, yeah. Then I just start thinking about, well, there are different kinds of academics. So you can be quite teaching focused and student experience focused, or you can become quite research focused, or you can, you know, go into kind of more management or, you know, leadership roles. And in my, you know, if I had to think about my identity, I always saw myself as a teacher more than as a researcher or academic, to say, right? So my identity was always, you know, I am the teacher. So I think that's why I get the satisfaction from the students, and I do get satisfaction from the research as well, because I also I like getting to know things, like learning more about why the world is the way it is. But you know, and it's great when you see your work published after you've been working on it. But I suppose it's not the same feeling that you know, that those interpersonal relationships, you know, actually give you.
Well, that desire for those interpersonal relationships, I mean, this is just my projection or maybe assessment, but I feel like you wouldn't go this far if it was purely just to get the satisfaction out of seeing someone else do well.
Well, look, I'm not saying that it's solely about that, but, you know, but a lot, you know, if you speak to, I think, most teachers, that's what they say, right? Obviously, you enjoy it personally, but, you know, does your satisfaction actually come from the lesson that you've prepared, the worksheet that you know, the way you've managed a kind of classroom, or the way you have the online learning platform? No, it's probably your satisfaction always comes from, you know, what you see the students getting out of what you actually give them, right? So, and I think it's much more immediate, the satisfaction, say, than research as well. So research is kind of like a very long-term, ongoing thing, and the more you get into it, you go into more holes. You know what I mean? That leads to other holes, right, and to more complexity, etc. So, and, you know, I can see why certain academics get the satisfaction from that. I enjoy it. But yeah, it's not as immediate, say, as teaching.
Well, I guess the better question then would be, why is that satisfaction your priority?
Yeah, look, yeah, who knows? It could be the fact that maybe teaching comes more naturally to me. It could just be as fundamental as that, and also the fact that, you know, research is all about a kind of ambition and competition, right? It's about grants and where you've published and what prestige you have and how many citations you get, etc. And that side of it has never kind of appealed to me, right? So it's almost like I have a pure interest in research, not necessarily, I mean, of course I need to get the publications because it's part of the career and it's what is expected of you, right? Once you have a certain level, but, I try not to make that overly a focus. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great point to end it on. And thank you so much for coming on. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.